continue our conversation about the foundations of morality. Remember that when we're talking about the foundations of morality, we're looking at the question, what makes actions right or wrong? By this, we don't mean which actions are right or wrong, or how do we know which actions are right or wrong. Those are important questions, as we've discussed, but they're not the same. Instead, we're looking at what it is for an action to be right or wrong, or what makes it so. And we've looked at a couple examples. For example, God says, do something or don't do it. That's an answer to the question. So what makes stealing wrong? God says, don't steal. Stealing's disobedient to God. That's what makes it wrong. Another example, somebody else might think, well, reason says there are some things we should do or some things we shouldn't do. That's another kind of answer. What makes stealing wrong? It's inconsistent to treat objects as if we can take them from others who reasonably possess them, but we object when others take objects from us that we reasonably possess. So stealing is rationally inconsistent, so it's wrong. That's another kind of answer we've looked at. Today we're going to look at another one. And Thomas Hobbes is a thinker who's going to guide us there. Thomas Hobbes lived in the 1600s. Take a look at where he sits. There's a couple of red lines that delineate his life in the red box. And take for just a moment, we won't do it all together, but look at who's alive at this time and who was alive before and who was alive afterwards and where this sits. I've circled a few figures for us to look at. These are figures that are important in American political history. This is George Washington in the upper right, and this is John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who were important thinkers that led up to the say to Thomas Jefferson and others who were writing in American political history. We'll look at them too. Let's look at Hobbes for a minute. Hobbes is a kind of social contract theorist, we'll see. He wrote a book called Leviathan. Leviathan means a sea monster. There's a picture of one up in the upper right. And the sea monster is an analogy, it's an image of government. Of big government. And big government political life in the time of Hobbes meant living under a sovereign or a king or a queen. Where was the source of that sovereign's authority? What made their commands right or wrong? Hobbes was sort of a maverick in a way. He argued that it wasn't what everybody tended to think. It wasn't the divine right of kings or divine appointment or divine command that made the king's actions right or wrong. Instead, there's a kind of contract that we have reason to make to bring the king into existence and to confer on him authority. And that contract comes out of a really nasty state of nature, which is our only other alternative. Here's some things he wrote about it. He says, during the time that men live without a common power to keep them all in awe. Who's that common power to keep them all in awe? That's the king, right? His Majesty, Her Majesty. Big, awesome deal. During the time without that king, we're in a condition that's called war. And it's everybody against everybody in that condition. In this condition, this war of every person against every other person, this is another thing that follows. You can't talk about justice or injustice or right and wrong. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, there have no place. Where there's no common power, that is no king, no government, there's no law. Where there's no law, there's no justice. Force and fraud in war are the cardinal virtues. So there is a kind of virtue, it's interesting. There is something that's in the state of nature, but it's not right and wrong. Moreover, there's no really civilization. There's no arts, there's no letters, there's no education, in other words. There's no society. And worst of all, there's nothing but fear, continual fear, and the danger of violent death. And then he sums all this up in this very famous sentence. And the life of man, the life of human beings, is alone, solitary, it's poor, it's nasty, it's brutish, and short. That's a quick look at what Hobbes says answers the question, where does right and wrong come from? It comes from an agreement that we have reason to make a contract that we have reason to make, because it's either the state of nature or it's this common power to keep them all in awe so that you can't fight. And that common power, that authority, that king, that government has an absolute authority because the alternative is so bad, according to Hobbes. You want to read more about Hobbes, here's a little bit of an overview, and you can read more of these quotes at the last link here. Now, Hobbes is a social contract theorist. What makes actions right or wrong is that some kind of agreement that we have made, and he's, though, not by himself. He inherits a past, and he helps shape a future. Thucydides, Plato, Locke, Rousseau, Jefferson, Rawls, Gauthier, these are all figures, important figures that we could look at, and we'll look at a couple of them when we meet together on Wednesday. Let's peek at them, a couple of them right now. Hobbes, again, lives in the 1600s, and all of that timeline sits in the upper left here. It's all from the section that's red to the right here. And all of that, from this entire section all the way through the brown, sits inside the common era. And all of that common era sits inside recorded history. And some of the folks that we'll look at, the very beginnings of this line of thinking, of this social contract line of thinking, begin even before what we think of as the AD-BC distinction here. Even older than that. Take a look. We won't read it right now together. Read it by class on Wednesday, and we'll talk about it on Wednesday. Thucydides' account of one particular episode. And look also at a much later account. This is the Declaration of Independence, in which some of the bonds that we enter into by contract are being dissolved. The political bonds, we're going to dissolve them, and we have to say why. We'll talk about that on Wednesday as well. And so, just to summarize here, we're going to talk about a third example of what makes actions and right or wrong. The sovereign, says Hobbes, makes the laws, but there's something even that underlies the sovereign. The sovereign gets their authority from all of us. We've made a reasonable contract to confer this absolute authority on the sovereign or on government to save ourselves from a fate even worse, the nasty state of nature. This is Hobbes. And in general, you might say that stealing is wrong because it's a violation of a contract we've made. Finally, take a look at these things. These are opportunities you're going to have to reflect on some of these things that we'll talk about on Wednesday. I won't read them for you now, but read them, and we'll come together on Wednesday to talk about them, and you'll have a chance after Wednesday to choose something in this neck of the woods and think about it further. Okay, thanks so much. See you Wednesday.